Well, good morning. It's good to be with you again. Some of you may remember the time that I was here with you before. I surely remember it. It was a very special time for me, a very blessed day for me, and so I'm delighted to be back and sharing this time with you. Is my microphone on okay? Can you hear it? Is it on okay?
It is.
All right, good deal. I wanted to make sure as we start. But I will brag a little bit about my sons. There's a verse in 3 John. It says that I have no greater joy than to know that my children are walking with the Lord.
That's right.
And when I think of my 4 sons, that's the great joy that I have, to know that my sons are walking with the Lord. I don't know everything about them. I don't know everything that they do. They're grown. They're out of our house now. They have families of their own. But it's a great joy and blessing to me to know that they still trust in the Lord and they look to Him and they seek to live for Him. They have given, as Pastor Francis mentioned, they have given my wife and me now 6 grandchildren. One of the reasons that I'm here this weekend is not only to be with you, but to be with our son Chris, who, as Pastor Francis said, he and his wife Brittany live in Fort Worth. They have a new son that's less than a month old. And so this was our first chance to see him. And so what a joy it's been this weekend to be here and to get to visit with them, to get to know our new grandson Caleb, and then also to be able to top it off by coming back and being with you guys again. What a joy it is. I want you to turn your Bibles this morning to the book of 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 5. It's a book that's over toward the end of the New Testament. You may be familiar with it, you may not. It's a book that deals with the idea and the theme of suffering. Suffering as a Christian. Have any of you ever suffered?
Yes.
Any of you ever been through any hard times, any difficult times?
Yes.
The Bible is a book that's very honest, it's very real, it's very realistic, and the Bible tells us that there's going to be suffering for all people, but there's going to be suffering for Christians as well.
Right.
But here's the thing, the Bible tells us that we have what we need to face that suffering and to come through it victorious. So the book of 1 Peter is a book that deals with that. The idea of suffering, that's the overall theme, one of the overall messages of this book. And so we come to chapter 5, and I want to begin in verse 5, about halfway through verse 5 of chapter 5. And I want to read down through verse 11. In verse 5, about halfway through, it says, all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud, but He shows favor, or that can also be translated, He gives grace. He gives grace to the humble. Verse 6, humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that He may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety or your care on Him, because He cares for you. Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of sufferings. Verse 10, and the God of all grace, who called you to His eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little bit or a little while, will Himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. And then verse 11, to Him be the power forever and ever. Amen. You know, anytime you study through quite a bit of material, maybe a lengthy study guide, lengthy study process. Maybe you've read a book, maybe you've read some kind of a journal, some kind of an article. After you come to the end of it, it's good to have maybe toward the end kind of a summary statement, or maybe a few summary sentences of what you've studied and what you've read and what you've been through. Well, we've already said that the book of 1 Peter is a book that deals with the idea of suffering. Suffering in the life of a believer. And how we as believers can have victory in our suffering. How we can come through it and be strong and be better after having gone through suffering. But you come down to the verses that we've read. These are kind of the final verses of the book. And in these final verses, Peter gives a summary of the major ideas that he's presented throughout this book. What we're going to do today is to look at about four principles that kind of summarize the main teaching and the main idea of this book of 1 Peter. Now, if you have your little handout, I hope that you will turn to the outline that's provided for you there. And I think these things are going to be provided here on the screen. The summary principles that we need to remember and we need to understand as we live our lives as believers and as we recall the teachings of this book. Here's what I'm going to do. Because I know myself and because I don't want to take too long, I know that I need to probably give you the last point first because we may not get to it. I know myself well enough to know that, okay? So I don't know what our projectionist is going to do with this, but if you can go to point number 4 first, and let me just give you what that is, because we may not get to it. All right? Number 4. Principle of stability. There it is. It is on the screen. Thank you, brother. Good job. Principle of stability. That can also be called security. Principle of security. Here it is. God offers you all you need to remain stable. Or if you choose the word security, you can use here the word secure. Stable or secure as you pass through suffering. God gives you all you need. Now, the last verse, verse 10, let's read it real quickly. And I want you to notice what all God gives us. It says in verse 10, the God of all grace. What does God give us? God gives us grace as we go through suffering. And then it says, who has called you into His eternal glory in Christ. What does God give you? He gives you glory. He gives you grace, the presence of grace. He gives you the promise of glory. And then notice also here in the last part of verse 10. He says, after you've suffered a little while, will Himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. That is, after you've gone through suffering, God is going to be able to grow you through that. So another thing that God gives you, He gives you growth. Here's what God gives you so that you can be secure and stable as you go through suffering. He gives you the presence of grace, the promise of glory, and the process of growth. And in all of that, He enables you to have all that you need to be stable and secure as you go through suffering. All right, we may not get to that, so we just did it. Now, let's go back to number 1, point number 1. What are some principles, some of the other principles that you need to remember as you go through suffering in order to be victorious? Number 1, principle of sovereignty. Principle of sovereignty. This is in the second part of verse 5 and verse 6. And here it is. It should be on your screen. Remember that God maintains sovereign control throughout your suffering. What does the word sovereignty mean? You know what that word means? To say that God is a sovereign God, what does that mean? It means that God has all power, God has all authority. God is in total control of everything that happens in your life and my life. He's in total control of everything that happens in this world. Now listen, the Bible teaches me, it seems to teach me, and I think it teaches all of us, that God exercises His sovereignty in different ways at different times. Sometimes He makes things happen, sometimes He lets things happen, and then He comes back and He responds and reacts to that. But God is always in control. He is always sovereign. And listen, dear friend, as you go through suffering, you need to remember that God is always in control of what's going on in your life. It's not a surprise to Him what's going on to you. It's not anything that He's been caught off guard by. God is a sovereign God. This is what you need to remember, because a lot of times when we go through a difficult time of suffering and hardship, a lot of times we begin to say, God, what's wrong here? God, are you even there? Are you... Listen, I've talked to a lot of people over the years who have said to me, because they had to go through some kind of suffering, because they had some kind of hardship in their family, maybe hardship at their work, maybe some person became ill, maybe a loved one died, because they've gone through suffering, they told me they don't believe there even is a God. There is no God. If there was a God, then why would these kind of things happen to me? Why would these kind of things happen? Why would the world be the way it is? A lot of people choose to believe that there is no God because of suffering. A lot of people, however, choose to believe that there is a God, but that He's just too weak to do anything about it. Yes, there's a God, but He's so weak and He's so impotent that He can't do anything about the suffering that's going on in my life. Because if He could, surely He would. Surely He would get me out of this. I mean, just get me out of it immediately. And then some people say, well, there is a God, and God has all power, but the fact that He allows me to suffer means that He's not a loving God. He doesn't love me. The beautiful singer that sang a moment ago spoke about the amazing love of God. How He seeks us, and He searches us, and He never gives up on us. Some people say, if I suffer, that must mean that God doesn't love me. A lot of people come to some false and improper conclusions about God because suffering is in their life. But I want you to understand that Peter is saying here at the very end of this book, he's talked about this all the way through, but he tells us again at the very end, he says, there is a sovereign God who is in control of everything that is happening in your life and in your world. Look at the way he says that. Let's just scan through verses 5 and 6 again. Look at what he says. In verse 5, he says, all of you clothe yourselves with humility. You know why you ought to be humble? You know why you need to always be humble? Because God is in control. And God is a sovereign God. And you and I don't need to try to be God. We wouldn't be a very good God anyway. We don't need to try to be God because God is God. We can be humble. Let's go on here. He says the last part of verse 5, he says, God opposes the proud, but He shows favor or grace to the humble. The reason that God can do that is because He is a sovereign God and He's in control of everything. So He's going to oppose and resist those who are proud and give grace to those who are humble. And then in verse 6 he says it again. He says, humble yourselves therefore where? He says, under God's mighty hand, because He is a sovereign God with all power and all authority and all control.
Yes, Lord.
You need to remember that God is a sovereign God when you go through suffering, and He's in control of things. And so that leads us to a few conclusions that we can draw. Now, I didn't put these on your outline, and these things are not going to be on the screen, but if you're a note taker, if you want something you can go back to, then you might just kind of jot these down as we go through here under number 1. Because God is a sovereign God, when we go through suffering, it gives us the response, our response when we go through suffering. What is our response to be? Well, look again. Verse 5. It says, all of you, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. This is the way that you're to respond to suffering when it comes into your life, because you know there's a sovereign God. What do? He says, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. Peter is basically saying, you need to be humble. You need to be humble. You don't need to be arrogant. You don't need to be mad. You don't need to be angry when suffering comes into your life. You don't need to think that you know more than God does about what ought to be going on in your life. You be humble. Clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. What Peter is basically saying here is that when you go through a time of suffering, because God is a sovereign God, Peter says you need to continue to be a humble servant to other people. That's the way you need to respond to suffering. Continue to be a humble servant to other people. Don't get mad. Don't get angry. Don't think God has done something wrong and God has made a mistake in your life. But you continue to humble yourself and be a servant to other people. Here's probably what Peter had in mind when he wrote these words: clothe yourself with humility to one another. He was probably thinking back to that night that is recorded in John chapter 13. It was the night, it was the evening before Jesus was going to be crucified. Jesus had gathered the disciples in an upper room, and while he was there, according to John 13, you remember what Jesus did? It says Jesus in John 13:4, he removed his outer garment, Jesus did, and he tied towels around his waist. He still had his inner garment on. He removed the outer garment, and he tied towels around his waist. And then do you remember what he did? He washed the disciples' feet.
Hello. Yes.
That was an act of humility. That was an act of service. That was something that only a slave was expected to do. When he would travel the long, dusty, dry roads of the Bible lands during this time, whenever you'd reach your destination, a slave would usually be the one that would take water and a towel and wash your feet. A slave would do that. But Jesus, the night before he went to the cross and experienced more suffering than any of us will ever have to experience. The night before he suffered, he took his disciples and he clothed himself in humility. He removed his outer garment, clothed himself in humility, took towels, took water, and he washed his disciples' feet. He wasn't saying to them, listen, it's about to be really bad for me. I'm about to die on a cross, so it's all about me. Think about me. Do stuff for me, because I'm the only one that cares. I'm the only one that matters. No, Jesus didn't do that.
Right.
As he was about to suffer in a way that none of us will ever have to suffer. Jesus clothed himself with humility, and he washed his disciples' feet. Here's our response. When we go through suffering, because God is a sovereign God, clothe yourselves with humility and keep serving others.
That's right.
That's what Jesus did. That's what we're to do. That's what Peter saw. That impressed him. And so he said, that's what we need to do, because God is a sovereign God. I don't have to be God. I can still be a servant. Second thing here, not only our response, but the reason that we respond with humility. Look at what he says, the last part of verse 5. He quotes from the book of Proverbs, and he gives a quotation. He says, here's the way you need to think about this. This is the reason that you need to be humble. He says, because God opposes the proud, but he shows favor, grace to the humble. Two things there. You keep serving for these two reasons. Number one, God opposes the proud. When you go through suffering, it's not good for you to bow your back, bow your back, and stiffen your neck, clench your fist and say, God, why are you allowing this to happen in my life? God, you've made a mistake. It's not a good thing for you to be proud and to think you know more than God does. Because what does it say here? It says, God opposes the proud.
Right.
I am so glad for that song that the dear woman sang. Is it Rose? Rose? Where's Rose that sang the song? Where is she? She's still in here?
Right here.
Rose, right there. I'm so glad for that song you sang about how God so loves us and He pursues us and He never lets up on us.
That's right.
But folks, here's another truth about God. That if we become proud, God opposes us. The meaning of that word oppose, it's basically a military term. It describes how armies are set up and armies are arranged in order to oppose another army that is their enemy. And it's like what is being said here is that God sets His armies against you if you're proud and if you're arrogant and if you think you know more about what will be going on in your life than God does. God sets the army of angels against you. Listen, dear friend, we need to understand that there are times, listen, there are times when God will be against us. We don't like to hear that, do we? And sometimes some of us may even think, well, that's not right, this is not biblical. But listen, it's right here. What we like to hear is that verse over in Romans chapter 8 where it talks about if God is for us, who can be against us? We like that verse, don't we? I love that verse. I need that verse. If God is for us, who can be against us? But here's the other part of that. There are times when if we're proud and we're arrogant and we ignore and defy God, then God Himself sets Himself against us. I want you to read sometimes the Old Testament prophets, and I want you to read of how many times as they were prophesying and talking to the people of Israel who'd become so idolatrous and so rebellious and so defiant and so arrogant toward God that they had chosen to worship other gods. I want you to see how many times the prophets of the Old Testament talk about how God is going to be against you. God is going to be against the religious leaders because the religious leaders did not present the truth that God wanted them to present. We don't like to hear that. And I don't like to have to say that. But it's in the Bible, and it's right here. That God opposes the proud. He resists them. He sets Himself against those who are proud. But here's the glorious truth that we love to hear and that we so desperately need. The second part of that is that God shows grace to those who are in need.
Say that.
He gives grace to the humble.
Yes. Yes.
When you humble yourself under a sovereign God,
That's right. That's right. That's right.
He gives grace to you.
Yes. Thank the Lord.
That was Paul's experience in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Remember 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul talks about his own life of suffering with a thorn in the flesh. He says there, now listen to this. He says, in order to keep me from being conceited, in order to keep me from being proud and arrogant, and thinking I don't need God, and thinking I know more than God. Paul said this. Paul said, in order to keep me from being conceited and arrogant, he says, God did what? God gave me a thorn in the flesh. He allowed a thorn in the flesh to come, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, to torment me, so I wouldn't be proud and arrogant. Paul says 3 times I prayed for God to remove that thorn in the flesh. God, please, please, this is just too much. This is just so hard. It's just so difficult. But you remember what God said to him? In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, the Lord said to Paul, He said, my grace is sufficient.
Hallelujah.
My grace is sufficient for you.
Thank you, Lord.
Well, I'm not going to remove that thorn in the flesh. You're going to have to deal with that. You're going to have to suffer with that.
That's right.
But my grace is sufficient for you. We already talked about point number 4 that we looked at to begin with. Point number 4, one of the things that we talked about that God is going to give you to help you through suffering is grace. He's the God of all grace down there in verse 10. God gives you the grace you need to deal with suffering. So the reason why you need to humble yourself before a sovereign God is because God will oppose you and God will be against you if you're proud. But He will give you grace if you humble yourself before Him. And then notice the third thing here, this real quick. Your results. Your results. Verse 6. Look at what happens. Verse 6. Humble yourselves therefore under God's mighty hand, that He may lift you up in due time. Here's the results.
Yes.
If you will humble yourself under
That's
God's mighty hand,
That's right.
then what happens? He will lift you up in due time. In due time. That means not your time schedule, not my time schedule, but it's His time schedule.
That's right.
He will lift you up. That's what happened to Joseph in the Old Testament book of Genesis. His brothers hated him. His brothers sold him. He was taken by a traveling caravan down into Egypt. He became a slave. He was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife. He was thrown in prison. He was forgotten. He suffered. He suffered. He suffered. He suffered. But what did he do? He kept humbling himself before God, and he kept looking to a sovereign God, trusting in a sovereign God, kept serving, even as he was forgotten in prison. He kept serving God in humility. And then what did God do? In due time, in God's time, not Joseph's time.
Hallelujah.
But in God's time, God raised him up to be the second most important person, powerful person in the land of Egypt. The results. Sovereign God. The principle of sovereignty. God's in control. Just yield, submit to it. Number 2, principle of serenity. We've got to finish. I'm sorry. I'm finished. Got to finish. Principle of serenity. When you pass through the stress of suffering, remain calm by casting all your anxiety on the Lord because He cares for you. I got to hurry. Sorry about this, but I got to hurry. Well, I don't want to lose the opportunity of ever being invited back, so I'm going to do this quick. Principle of serenity. How do you have peace when you go through suffering? We'll do what verse 7 says. Just cast all your anxiety upon Him because He cares for you. He cares for you. This word cast that is used here, the only other place in the New Testament that this particular word is used is in Luke 19, verse 35, where Jesus sends 2 men into the city of Jerusalem to get a colt. He says, you're going to find a colt there. He says, untie that colt and bring it to me. And that's what Jesus was going to ride into the city of Jerusalem on the last day, last week of His life, just before He was crucified. Remember that story?
Yes.
If you look at Luke 19:35, the two disciples have gone, they found the colt, they bring the colt back to Jesus. And here's what they do. Luke 19:35 says, it uses the same word that's used here, cast or throw. It says they cast or they threw their garments onto that colt that Jesus was about to ride. They cast their garments onto that colt, as if to make a saddle for Jesus, as if Jesus would have a saddle to ride on as He rode that colt into the city of Jerusalem for the final time before His crucifixion. And it's that word that Peter uses right here, where he says, cast or throw your anxiety upon the Lord. And because of that other verse where that word is used, it's almost as though Peter is saying, don't try to saddle yourself with all the worry and all the anxiety and all the fear that you may experience as you go through suffering. Cast that saddle upon Jesus. Put that saddle on Him. Let Him be the one that is saddled with all the worry and all the fear and all the things you have to think about. Let Him worry about that. Don't saddle yourself with all that worry. It's more than you can handle. It's more than I can handle. We've got a sovereign God.
Yes.
We don't need to worry about those things. God is taking care of those things. What we need to do is just humble ourselves before Him and keep serving as He's called us to serve. Serenity. And then number 3, the third principle, susceptibility. Principle of susceptibility. It's a big word. It's there on the screen if you need help with spelling it. I surely did. I had to look it up. Since suffering, here it is, since suffering makes you more susceptible to temptation, you must stand firm in righteousness. Look at what he says now, verses 8 and 9. He says, be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the whole world is undergoing the same kind of sufferings. Again, got to be quick here, but I want you to notice here what he's talking about. He's saying that as you go through a time of suffering, you're going to be more susceptible to the attacks of Satan. You go through a time of suffering, and what does it do? It tends to weaken you. It tends to weaken you physically. It tends to weaken you emotionally. Sometimes it weakens you mentally and spiritually. And so when you become weakened, that it says here that Satan becomes like a roaring lion. He's just roaming around. He's looking for somebody who's weak. He's looking for somebody who's weak. When lions go on the hunt, when lions are looking for prey, oftentimes lions will look for the animal that is weak, the animal that is handicapped in some way, the animal that's not able to keep up with the rest of the herd. And so the lion then will pounce on that animal that's weak and falling behind. And that's the one that Satan, that's the one that the lion devours. And in the same way, that's the kind of person that Satan will devour. When you get weak because you're going through suffering, Satan is looking to devour you. So what does he say here? He says here, in verse 9, he says, what is this, Tim? Standing firm in the faith. I want you to notice there that he says, the faith. He doesn't say stand firm in faith, just any faith. Just believe in anything. But the definite article is used here in the original language. It means the faith. So what it means is the faith that is revealed in God's Word. You need to stand firm on the faith as you find it here in the Word of God. Did you know that that's exactly what Jesus did when Jesus was tempted by Satan? Remember that story? Matthew 4. Jesus had been fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. And he was hungry. He was physically weakened. And so what does Satan do? Satan is roaming around, looking like a roaring lion, trying to find somebody to devour. Well, here's Jesus. Jesus is weak. Jesus is hungry. I'm going to pounce on him and destroy him. What did Jesus do? Satan came to him and Satan said, Jesus, you're hungry, so just turn the stones into bread. Jesus, you're hungry, so just give in to your physical urges and give in to your physical desires. And what did Jesus say? What did Jesus do? Jesus said, it is written. It is written that man does not live by bread. Satan took Jesus to the highest point of the temple and said, if you're the Son of God, then just jump off. The angels will catch you before you fall. And what did Jesus say? Jesus said, it is written. It is written that you do not put the Lord your God to a test.
That's right. Don't tempt him.
And Satan took Jesus to a high mountain, showed him all the earth, and said, you can have all of this if you'll just bow down and worship me, Satan said. Jesus, just worship me, and you can have the whole world, the whole earth. Listen, Jesus had already created the whole world. He didn't need Satan to give it to him. And so he said, listen, he said, it is written.
That's right.
It is written that you are to worship the Lord your God and serve Him only.
That's right.
What did Jesus do when He was weak? What did Jesus do when He was tempted? Jesus stood firm in righteousness because Jesus stood firm on the Word of God. It is written.
Yes.
Folks, when you go through temptation, when you go through suffering, you're going to be much more susceptible to temptation because you're going to be weak. And you're going to get tired. And you're going to get weary. And you're just going to try to find some quick way out, some easy way out. That's when you got to stand firm on God's Word, as Jesus did. The principle of susceptibility. Remember that when you go through suffering. We've already done number 4, and we're out of time. But listen, dear friends, we have time for you to respond to God's call, to God's Word. There may be some of you today that have just wandered in this place. I don't know the crowd. I don't know. Maybe all of you are regulars. If so, that's wonderful. God bless you. But even if you are a regular, whether you're new, whether you're a regular, you've probably been through suffering. You may be going through it right now. Most of us are. Folks, you've got a sovereign God who's still God. You don't have to try to be God. You don't have to try to figure all this out. What you do is simply humble yourself before Him. You trust Him and let Him be in control.